There is a pandemic happening. And no, I'm not talking about COVID-19. I'm talking about LS swaps. Now there's a million reasons why these motors are super popular. You can find them pretty cheap, pretty easy to work on. They make amazing horsepower with minimal financial commitment, and the aftermarket world supports it so that you can pretty much swap these things into just about anything you want. I pulled this motor out of a 2002 Suburban that had wiring issues and cosmetic issues and a lot of other issues. This motor had about 250 some thousand miles. I forget the exact number, but it was a lot. I already went ahead and pulled the coil packs off and hosed this thing down with some engine degreaser and the old pressure washer. I've gotten it basically down to just the engine. When you start pulling all the wiring off, label everything. Take tons of pictures. Pictures are free. Your phone that you're watching this on the toilet probably has a camera on it. Because if you're like me, you'll think you'll remember, but when it comes time to put it all back together, you won't remember. Things like the serpentine belt. Take lots of good video picture of that, write it down, make sure you know the direction of it, because all of these accessories spin a certain direction. So if you don't get the serpentine belt on there correctly, you'd be in all kinds of trouble. Now the ultimate goal, like I said, is to make it a good, reliable motor. I've done a ton of research, online forums, Facebook groups, good old YouTube University. I've got these books that I'm gonna follow. First is the old Haynes manual. This has got a ton of good information in there, especially things that you're going to need to know as far as torque specs, all of that sort of stuff. I got another book here. This is a really good book. It's called How to Rebuild GM LS Series Engines. Might as well say for dummies. This thing is chock full of amazing information, and it's just a fun read even if you just want to nerd out on how these engines work, because it's a little bit different than your grandpa's old 350. Some of these bolts on here are what they call torque to yield bolts, and you have to do them in sequences, like start with 20 pounds, go 90 degrees, take it off, give it a little back massage, and then put it back on there. Weird stuff like that. So first things first, let's identify all of these sensors, because there are several and they're important. Here we are at the rear of the engine. We'll start up here on top of the manifold. This one right here is your map sensor. Back here at the back of your engine block, this one here is an oil pressure sensor, and then this one here is your camshaft sensor. You've got two sensors down here. One is in the oil pan. This is for your dummy light that shows you your oil level. So if your oil level goes too low, you got your dummy light that'll light up saying, hey dummy, fill the oil. And then you've got this guy right up here. This is your crankshaft position sensor. That's important for like timing and stuff like that. Up here again, the back top of the engine. This one here is for your knock sensors, and this goes underneath the manifold to your knock sensors. Now to the front of the engine, again up here on top, this one here goes to your evap system that goes back to your gas tank. And then on your throttle body, you've got two of them. The top one here is your idle air controller, and then the bottom one here is your throttle position sensor. And then on the front down here on the side, right in front of the #1 exhaust port, this is your coolant temp sensor. I'm gonna drain the coolant out of this. Now the engine block has a couple of plugs that you can pull out to drain it out. There's one on either side. This one over here on the passenger side, directly above the oil pan plug. And then there's also one on the driver's side. It's right above your oil filter. We'll just do the best we can to drain as much of the coolant out as possible, but you and I both know it's impossible to pull a motor apart without making a huge mess. And coolant is one of the worst offenders. So don't do this in your living room. And now I already started soaking down these bolts that hold these manifolds on with the penetrating fluid. We've got one of these manifold bolts that's broken off. Hopefully that's not going to be a pain to pull out of there. I also soaked down the nut that holds the fan on. Since these are aluminum heads, you have to be super careful. Don't just grab your impact and go to town on it, because you're going to either strip out the threads or you're going to break a bolt off. So you'll notice I'm just using this little breaker bar and kind of using some light tension and trying to keep it as straight as possible and going slow, taking my time, and eventually they'll all come out. Man, these things are heavy, but I'm gonna hang on to these because if and when I ever do a turbo setup, these are actually gonna come in handy. The fan was a pain in the butt to get off. They make a special tool. It goes in these holes here on the pulley and it holds the pulley in place, and then you can get a wrench on there and turn that nut off. I went down to my local AutoZone and rented this tool. This one is a universal one. As you can see, I had to make these pins here. So I just took a couple of bolts and bolted them on there. And then to keep the handle of this thing in place, I just use a screwdriver to hold it in place with the alternator so it can't spin. That way I can put all my weight on the wrench because it was on there pretty tight. I used the old spanner wrench here, and this went to the widest setting, which 31, 2, 3, 4, it's probably 35 millimeter. Don't quote me on that. It's a massive sucker. Once I got it on there, it came off super easy. Now to get the accessory drive off, there's 5 bolts. There's 4 of these longer ones that go 3 on the top and then 1 down here on the bottom below the power steering pump. And then there's 1 on the side of the motor that is a shorter bolt, and that just bolts the back of the power steering pump to the block itself to kind of help keep it in place because the serpentine belt is under tension. And then I'm gonna pull the water pump off of here. So there's just 6 bolts holding this thing on here. And again, I'm gonna leave the top bolts kind of loose in place because I wanna support the weight of the water pump as I'm pulling it off. Now we'll get to pulling off the intake manifold. All right, now that I got the intake off, I can inspect it, and each one of these intake ports has quite a bit of buildup in it, which is pretty common. I'm not sure if I'm gonna send these heads off to get head work done, but I am going to replace these knock sensors. These are kind of a pain to get to when this thing's in the car, so I'm gonna replace everything that I can while it's disassembled, because really there's no reason not to. First things first, I wanna clean this thing up a little bit, and before I do that, I'm gonna stuff some shop towels down in these intake ports so none of this dirt that's sitting on here is going to fall down in there. So there's all kinds of water built up in here, which is pretty common problem that these engines have had. Before I disconnect the wiring and all that stuff, I'm going to try to get as much of that crap out of there as possible. So these come off by squeezing these tabs just like that, and then it'll release. There's a lot of buildup on the bottom of this thing. So now at this stage, we are going to need to take the heads off. But before we do that, we got to get these rockers off of here to get the push rods out. Once again, we're not going to use the impact to break these loose. I'm going to break them loose by hand, and then you can zip them off with your impact. I'm not sure I'm going to reuse these push rods, but if you are, you want to keep them in order. The best way to do that is to get yourself a cardboard box and label it. I've got the front of the motor, I've got driver's side over here, passenger side over here, and then I've just punched holes with a screwdriver so I can put the rods in here, and I labeled them per cylinder. Now we're ready to remove these head bolts. You got 5 inside here down the middle and 5 on the outside. These are all 15 millimeter. You've got 5 in here by where the intake is, and these are 10 millimeter. When you take them off, you're gonna wanna go sort of in the opposite sequence of how you torque them down. Once again, we'll break them loose by hand, and then we can zip them off with the impact. All right, now we can get these lifters out of here, and they're connected in these trays right here, and it's a 10 millimeter bolt to get them out. Where's my 10 millimeter? Yeah, I got none of them. Every lifter I try to take out does this to me. Some of those lifters were pretty stuck in there because of the buildup. I had to give them a good twist. It took a little bit more than a magnet to get them out of there, but I was able to work them all out. Now we can remove this cam sensor on the back of the block right here. Man, this thing has a really funny smell. I'm not really sure what it is. There's no signs of a blown head gasket or anything. It kind of smells like a mixture of burning bald eagle and dolphins. Let's do a little bit of inspecting. From first glance, there's some good and some bad. There's a lot of buildup, pretty much is to be expected because this motor does have 260,000 miles, something like that on it. The amazing thing is in most of these cylinder walls, you can still see cross hatching. That's actually pretty common with these motors, which is one of the reasons why these motors are so great. Now we can pull this crank pulley off of here so that we can get the timing cover off. In order to do this, we're going to block the flywheel at the rear of the motor to keep the crank from spinning. I also soaked this with some penetrating fluid for a couple of days. Hopefully it'll come off here pretty easily. And before we get cranking on this bolt for this crank pulley, I'm going to support the front of this engine just because there's a lot of downforce you got to push on it. And just to be safe, I'm going to put a jack stand up under the front part of it here. Now, I know they say not to use impact on this one, but man, this thing is on there and it is not coming off. So I'm gonna carefully bust it off with the old impact here. So I'm gonna soak this thing with this penetrating fluid and then go eat lunch and come back and see if we can get this pulley off of here. All right, we're back. We let this soak for a few hours or so, and hopefully it's going to come off there pretty easily. You got to use one of these 3-jaw puller deals on there and center it up on your crank and just start cranking away. Now we need to get this timing cover off, and before we do that, we got to flip the motor upside down and take the oil pan off because there's a couple of bolts on the bottom side that are also holding the oil pan on. Look at all the sludge. This thing is disgusting. This thing is dirtier than a Roman butt sponge. Again, 260-some thousand miles. The timing chain is pretty well stretched. So now we're gonna get these pistons out of here. So we'll take these caps off. And surprise, surprise, these are not 10 millimeter or 13 millimeter. They are 11 millimeter. Again, we'll bust them loose by hand and then we can zip them off. These factory rods are cracked rods. What that means is they are made as one piece and then they crack the cap off. It's super important to make sure you get the right cap on the right rod. So don't mix them up. As we inspect these pistons, there's no signs of excessive wear or hot spots. In fact, you can still see all the factory machining on the skirts. And now it's time to break these main caps loose, and there's 6 bolts. There's 2 in the middle, 2 on the outside, and then you have these bolts out here on the outside of the block. So these inner bolts are a 13 millimeter socket. The outer ones are 15, and then the ones on the outside of the block are 10 millimeters. These caps are designed to fit tightly. Obviously, you don't want them to slop around. They make a special tool to pull the main caps off, but you can also use a couple of long extensions on either side and kind of work them out. Sometimes they just need a little bit of love with a persuader. Now we'll remove the crankshaft, and I don't trust my own ab strength, so I'm gonna use the old cherry picker to pull it straight up and out, being super careful not to scratch any of the journals. All right, I got all the caps put back on here and the bearings are pulled out. The machine shop is gonna want these caps, so you wanna make sure you put them back on there, all the bolts and stuff. Nothing's torqued down. They're put in there so they're tight, they're not gonna fall out. Well, look at all these rod bearings right here. There's no sign of burning, no sign of scourging. They all came out just like this. I mean, if I was roadkill, I would just reuse these. Now, when we look at the main bearings, no signs of burning, no signs of scourging. They practically look brand new. I mean, I'm not gonna, but you could almost reuse these. Let's flip the motor over and we'll pull the cam out. You can see where it's got wear marks from the rollers, but it's not grooved. And all of these lobes, they're not flat. They look pretty good. There's nothing wrong with this camshaft. It's just not high performance enough. So I've got a camshaft that's got a little bit bigger lift, but this one looks pretty good. Just need a little bit more beef. Well, I got this thing torn down. I called the machine shop and asked them how much they wanted me to remove. I got all the plugs and everything out of this thing. It's ready to go to the machine shop. So that's gonna do it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, like, share with your friends. See you next time.